Nancy McLaughlin-Walter. She's joining us from the University of West Georgia. And just briefly, this happened because of a really great grant that we got from Jeff Walker, who wanted to see more collaboration between Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA and Monroe Institute. I had been talking about that for a few years after seeing so many talented people coming through Monroe and doing stuff. I said, this is just an amazing resource for research. And then I met Jeff at, he was taking a gateway, came over to the lab, and we talked a bit about what was going on, the research programs and whatnot. And, you know, he came up with the idea, let's do some collaboration. I'll give you a grant to get a researcher who would be stationed at DOPS UVA, but do most of their time with Monroe research. And so Nancy's 80% Monroe, 20% DOPS. And the fantastic advantage of this is that at DOPS, for example, we have a whole setup platform for data analysis for EEG, for example. And lots of experience with that. So when Nancy joined us, we started getting her up to speed on that. And as I was describing yesterday, she was doing a lot of the editing on all those EEG cases in the discovery program. So that right away sort of started kicking things into higher gear for me, and we were able to get some results from that study. Now, Nancy's, her field of study at University of West Georgia is survey instruments and factor analysis with a focus in parapsychology. Survey instruments, this is another thing she's bringing in that I don't have much experience in. Those surveys, questionnaires, how you analyze those. And I think that's really pretty desperately needed at Monroe. Find out what people are experiencing. Let's systematically start accumulating their responses, their descriptions, what's happening, and Nancy's going to be able to do that. And the advantage of being at UVA is that she can get IRB approvals at UVA, so we can get access to more mainstream journals for Monroe research. So I think that kind of sets the stage for what Nancy's doing. It's really great. It's a big help. And without further ado, let me turn you over to Nancy.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Like Ross said, I'm from the University of West Georgia, and if no one knows about the University of West Georgia, I suggest you go research it. They have a phenomenal parapsychology department. Dr. Christine Simmons Moore is just an awesome professor there. Since everyone else was sharing stories of how they got to Monroe, let me share mine a little bit, because it is, for me, it's quite phenomenal. I was in my last year of my graduate work at the University of West Georgia, and I was trying to decide, like all PhD students, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I don't really want to teach. My passion is research. And so what I did is what I always do, is I wrote everything down that I could imagine my life being for the next decade. And at the time, I had wanted to open up a retreat center where people would learn about mindfulness and all these other fascinating things, and they would be able to take classes, and they would be able to stay there and cook, and just, it would be up in the mountains, and I'm not joking about this, it would be up in the mountains with a beautiful view, just very pastoral, and everything that you could imagine Monroe being is what I wrote on my list, without ever having any previous knowledge of what the Monroe Institute was or would be for me in the very near future. And the one thing I had wrote down is that I wanted people to stay in yurts. So it was quite fortuitous that I think it was just a few weeks later, I had gotten this job description and I was asked to apply, which I did. Still didn't know what Monroe was. So I applied, not even knowing that my dissertation supervisor actually had a connection with Monroe. And then when I came up to do my interview with Ross, we were headed up to RMR, and Scott at the time was in the passenger seat, and he says, "Oh, Nancy, by the way, we have our own resident yurt down in the gully if you look down there." And for me, that was just like, okay, that's it. This is my job, and this is where I'm meant to be. It seemed like everything I wrote down was just coming to light. What I was asked to do today is to talk to you about research in general, what type of research or types of research and methods. So I'm pretty sure I'll be preaching to most of the choir here when I talk about research, but I wanted to present it in a way that others would understand how, not just how important it is, but how easy it can be to conduct research and why is it so important, particularly at Monroe, for us to be conducting research as well. I just want to talk a little bit about ethics in research, why it's important. So in research, we have to conduct ourselves according to certain behaviors and guides that provide us with some moral and ethical decisions about what we do and why we do. And the goal of this is to ensure that no one is harmed and no one suffers adverse consequences from research activity. And we have some people to thank for that. One of them would be like Zimbardo, his famous prison experiment, and Milgram, of course, with his obedience experiments. So when we talk about ethics, we talk about how to conduct research in a way that isn't going to harm others, but is also ethical to the standards of research. So are we collecting data in a way that is going to be true to what we're actually looking for? Because you do have people that will blow their studies out of proportion or make claims that they really shouldn't be making or have no evidence to back up. One of them I will say is quite funny, was a dissertation. This person had determined that there was an hour of the day, one day a year, where there were absolutely no traffic accidents or fatalities. And he had researched this through his dissertation, and he's almost successfully defended this position until someone caught on that he wasn't adjusting for daylight savings time. So that hour was between 2 and 3 a.m., where he wasn't accounting that there was an actual change in time, clocks went back or clocks went forward, and that was that hour, that period of time where there were no traffic accidents or fatalities. So we really have to be careful. That's something that would be unethical to actually promote and publish. But there's also other things that we want to make sure that we're respecting all people. So what we do at Monroe, we want our research to be able to promote what people are coming, what they expect. They expect this experience, and they want to explore, their consciousness. And it's our responsibility in research to not only make sure that they're able to get that, but that their experiences being transpersonal and transformative, we also have to take into consideration that they're uniquely personal and meaningful to them. And we want to make it accessible to them as well. And the whole time we also want to make sure that we're not pushing them to do something that they are not capable of doing, or making them feel like they're not enough. What they're doing is not enough. And we all know that you can also have these transpersonal experiences without actually the transformative aspect to it, and that can be detrimental for the person as well. So we really want to ensure that our research that goes out the door is going to keep in mind who is our audience and how are we responsible to our audience as well. And while we're conducting research, we need to understand that what is our purpose? At Monroe, it's we're looking for exploration, but we're also looking to provide a venue for people to have these experiences that they're searching for, whether that be out of body or connecting with someone through guidelines. We want to make sure that that's something that's obtainable for them. We don't want to promise the moon and then not be able to even provide the sunlight for them. So these are just some of the codes and mandates that persons who conduct research should inform your participants about. And I won't go through all of these, but you should, if you decide to do research, whether on your own or collaboratively, these are some of the things that you're going to keep in mind. Here at Monroe, we do have an internal review board. And at the University of Virginia, there are additional reviews that our research has to go through because we do collect sensitive personal data, EEG information, and hopefully in the near future, some other bioinformation as well that will help us with our research. And we need to make sure that our participants are safe and so is their information. We don't want to have it anywhere where it would be disclosed to anybody. I wanted to address some of the practical issues that we face in research. Depending on the scope of your research and who you're working with and what your subject pool is going to be. If these issues might not be relevant or they could be relevant to you. So at Monroe, we're fortunate that we have a pool of potential participants to participate in our research. And the work we do is so important for many people, even if they're unfamiliar with Monroe. They understand and that they're seeking this knowledge and they want to participate in helping everyone better understand it. So it's our mission to do more than just dabble in the areas of expanded consciousness. We need to really fine tune not just the accessibility to the technology that's produced, but also refine that technology and the programs so that the individual is given the opportunity to pursue their path and reach their full potential in their exploration. Some other practical issues other than a pool of participants, access to participants, would be funding, of course. Funding is always an issue. Whereas Monroe, we don't necessarily have a lack of participants. We do come up against adequate funding for the research that we do. There are things involved like research for, the equipment that we use, software, salaries, Ross's innovations. He loves to build these wonderful devices that help us understand the experience and help provide feedback to a participant so that they know immediately, is something working for them? Is it, are they seeing a result? And Ross is really good at doing that. And Bob Holbrook's, his audio creations. So all of this costs the institution, not just time, but money as well. Even though our volunteers, our participants are mostly volunteers, there are times where we do want to bring in someone who has a specialized talent that we're interested in understanding more of, so then we can apply it more broadly to the general population at Monroe. How do we understand the person so that we can then use that and apply it to other people? So we want a generalizability. For instance, Joe McMoneagle, I know he's in the hospital this morning. I'll keep him in my prayers as well as my daughter's. It took quite a bit of research to understand how Joe does what he does. And it took some highly skilled individuals in that process. Bob Monroe really had to ask a lot of questions and start digging for answers in ways that he probably didn't even expect to have to go into. So for instance, I don't know how many of you are ambidextrous, but if I were to try to get Joe at the very beginning of his understanding his abilities to fully explain how he does what he does, he probably would not be able to explain it very well. It's like if you're ambidextrous, would you be able to explain the actions that are, your brain is creating to then make you able to, use both hands at the same time or individually, but both hands equally? So it's important as research that we try to get at those answers through the questions that we ask. And like Ross said, that's where my experience is in factor analysis and building these instruments. It's a little more than that, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But it's factor analysis can be quite involved. So it's important that we understand the questions or understand how to ask the questions to get the answers that we want to obtain. And equipment like the EEGs and fMRI and even the heart rate variability, they are very useful in helping us either accept or reject our hypothesis, which is, our best educated guess. And it's not just a guess. We do a lot of literature research. We build off the backs of others just to understand where, what questions we should be asking and what our hypothesis should be. We just don't pull things out of the air. And if we do, we make sure we research it very well, because it's most likely somebody else has asked that question before, and maybe they did a work on it, but they didn't do it in a way that is how you want to look at it. Maybe they missed something, or they forgot, or they just didn't consider something. So I know yesterday, Dr. Gaunt, her presentation was just phenomenal. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. But most of us had the question at the end when she said that people with tinnitus did not appreciate the binaural beat technology. And I, for one, am someone who has tinnitus as well. And I was like, would I listen to binaural beat music? So that's one thing she didn't see. She was seeing it in her population, but maybe it's not in the entire population. So those are things we have to consider as well. Right. So the types of research methods that we have are, we have access to qualitative or quantitative. And that is, it's probably self-explanatory, but qualitative has really gained some traction over the last several years as being very important to the research. If you were at PMH Atwater's talk yesterday, the work that she does is qualitative case studies. And that's very important, because without something like qualitative, we don't really understand the subject's personal experience. And it's also a venue for discovery. We can actually do a thematic analysis on qualitative work and do a inductive where we actually we already have this and then create a hypothesis, versus the deductive where we have the hypothesis and then we want our research to support that. So with qualitative, we're working in the opposite direction, and it could be that we're trying to either prove something or build a theory towards something when we're doing qualitative. And it can be very effective in instances where we might not even know that something actually exists. And I'll get into that in a moment. So for instance, let's go back to the tinnitus example. From our own experiences, with binaural beats, those of us in here who were here yesterday, and we do have tinnitus, that was not our experience. But if no one asks that question, how are we to know that that's what the experience is? So Dr. Gaunt, she asked her participants, and they were reporting to her that it was definitely a factor in how unpleasant the experience was for them. But that's not for everyone. But if we don't ask those questions, or we don't even know to ask those questions, and through her qualitative work, the feedback she was getting, she was able to find out what was good for the subject and what was not. So it's important to also report, have people report their experience as well. It's also to understand, we can understand so much more about it. So there's more than one way of experiencing tinnitus. Some actually have something wrong with the ear itself. But my tinnitus, for instance, isn't from my ear. I have perfect hearing, but I have a constant high-pitched tone that the neurologist said is from my auditory cortex. Either that is where the damage is, or the pathway between the ear and that area is disrupted, and it's causing this very high-pitched noise that I've had for several years. So there's not something, that noise isn't being generated in my ear. It's being generated by my brain or the pathway to that area. So a case study would be PMH Atwater's work yesterday. And the case study doesn't have to be one case. It can be multiple cases, but it's specific to a population where that they are experiencing whatever it is that you're trying to observe, versus someone, who's doing a larger study where we just want to know if anyone or everyone in the population is actually experiencing this as well. So in a case study, let's see, synesthesia. How many of you are actually experience synesthesia? I'm one of those people, but I did not know that I was one of those people until someone asked me the right questions. So what I had someone ask me is, I took a questionnaire and it seemed like I did, but she wasn't sure. So she would ask me, well, how do you perceive time? Is time like the calendar that we see on the wall or in the phone? Or is time represented in another way? So for me, I don't see days of the week like we see it on a regular calendar. In my mind, it's a little different, and it's more cyclical. And also the times of the day, I don't have a 24-hour clock or representation in my mind, and I don't have a 12-hour representation of time either. For whatever reason, my brain has decided that time is broken up into 6 hours. So 12 p.m. to 6 p.m., 6 p.m. to 12 a.m., 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., and then 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. And that's been since I was a child. That's how I see it. And I see time going around. So it goes up a line and then down. So it's more, horizontal, and vertical than it is along a timeline. But if no one had asked me that, I would never have suspected that I was synesthete, because we mostly understand synesthetes to be someone who, might taste colors or hear music with number representation. You probably already do research in whatever work you're doing. I know even as a parent, we're doing research, especially as new parents. You want to know what works, what doesn't, what makes the kid laugh, what makes the kid cry. We don't ever want to do that anymore. So you're already doing research. So it is actually easier than you may think it already, you may think it is. So you're already making inferences. How are your participants getting feedback from how are you getting feedback from those people? What are they saying? Is something working? Is something not? Is something novel? Maybe someone is coming up with this, oh, this doesn't work for me, but yet it works for everybody else. So why doesn't it work for that one person? So you might want to probe a little deeper. So we're already doing research, just not in a formal way. We want to know if, are things effective, what we're doing, what's our progress, and what changes need to be made to further the progress. So maybe tweaking programs. So Bob may get feedback from people who are listening to the music and saying, I don't really like hearing the whales or the ocean. I just want to hear the pure tones and with a slight overlay of tracks, which is my preference. And also, like with the SAM music, I think Bob was having, some people were reporting some vestibular disruptions when they were listening. And that is really necessary feedback for him to then adjust how he's working. So one way you can make it a little more formal is actually keep notes. Don't just take mental notes, but actually write things down, because we have a tendency to forget, or we have a tendency to generalize, and it doesn't really do us any justice in the research if we aren't keeping track of these things, particularly not just the mundane, but the popular stuff as well, because we can start seeing some trends. So we share knowledge from our research like we're doing now. Ross shared his yesterday, Dr. Gaunt, Dr. Atwater. We all love to share what we know, and it just comes naturally. It's why we join professional associations. It's why we attend webinars, and why we talk to colleagues and write books and articles and professional papers. It's why we attend conferences. We want to know what others know, and we want to share what information that we have as well. So then, if we're looking to do something a little more formal, we want to establish a research question. And your research question should really satisfy at least 2 points. They can be more elaborate than this, but this is pretty basic. I'm sorry if I'm being too basic. I'm used to teaching, intro to psychology, and so I have to really dial things down for some students. So it should satisfy at least 2 points. So if what, then what? So for example, as virtual social interaction increases, online education, seminars, etc., and face-to-face interpersonal engagement decreases, the greater the challenges will be for fostering environmental social behavior cues in adolescence. And if you're interested in that study, I can send you the link to that. But until the pandemic hit, who would even think to ask such a question? We already understand that adolescents need social interaction to actually formulate what they want to be as an adult, understand others, and also their social positioning in the world. But until virtual school had to become a thing, who would know that it would be a detriment? Except for those of us who are like, oh, you're giving your kids technology and they're probably not learning how to make eye contact with other people, which I learned from raising my own daughter. I noticed that she couldn't make eye contact with people that she wasn't familiar with. She was very uncomfortable with that. And that's a social cue that you learn from being around other people. Collaborating. This is very important. So my position, like Ross said, is funded by Jeff Walker, who he saw the need for collaboration between the wonderful work that's done at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the university and the awesome work that's being done at the Monroe Institute. There needed to be some collaboration there in order for things to move forward, and also to lend some credence to both. So at DOPS, they tend to be very academic, and Monroe tends not to be very academic. So we needed to marry those two and do some more collaboration to actually raise up both institutions. So when we're collaborating, we definitely have to work with the internal review board. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that process. Monroe has an internal review board, and as well as UVA has a review board. And the review boards can vary from institution to institution. My position is actually through the university, but also through the health services aspect. So I have to be very conscientious of HIPAA violations and really laying out things properly so that the university understands that I'm not going to put anyone in jeopardy, and not just them in jeopardy by having them go into like a Kundalini experience where they're never going to come back from or something, but also that I'm going to protect their information. And there's a process for that. So if I have all of your names and addresses when I'm doing research on you, when I actually put your information into a program to collect, I'm going to want to assign you a separate number for that, so that your actual name and information is not associated with any of the information that you provide to us as researchers, in case we're hacked or things get accidentally uploaded to the wrong server, or like sometimes I get emails from health services from doctors who are obviously trying to collaborate with another Nancy Walter, and they just type in an email and it pops up me instead of the other Nancy. So I'm now privy to patient information, and that's something that we definitely want to avoid. So that's very important. And you have to show these, you have to tell the review board all these things. They're going to ask you not just what you're going to do, what your protocol is going to be, what exactly you're looking at, but how are you going to protect your participants as well? How are you going to ensure these ethics are in place and that you're not going to harm someone inadvertently through either sharing their information or through subjecting them to things that might be detrimental to their health or their mental health as well. And then we also want to ask, this one's important, how will it advance the science? How will it advance humanity? How will it advance treatment? We don't want to we can't just do research for the sake of doing research. Oh, I want to see, if this person will give me this information if I poke them with a stick or something. You really have to say, okay, I want to poke this person with a stick because that's the only way to get this information that's actually going to advance the treatment of stick poking or something. So we really have to make sure that we're laying this all out for the IRB. And then we have to obviously submit paperwork, and then we have to adhere to that, consent forms, approval forms, and whatever the format is for the actual research. Pardon me if I get a little geeky or nerdy here for a little bit, but factor analysis is something I'm very passionate about. And I've been involved with factor analysis for probably, I don't know, 10, maybe 12 years. When I had a professor ask me to help him work on designing an instrument for something he wanted to do. So one thing that's important to understand in factor analysis is that anything we do, any questions that we might ask to get at something, these questions are going to be made up of factors. So let's take for an example the personality measure, what we understand to be the big five or the ocean. So that is broken down into the factors of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Those are the 5 factors. And I think they're down to probably 6 questions now. Correct me if I'm wrong. 6 questions per each factor. And what factor analysis does is make sure that the questions that they're asking are actually relative to openness. So how would you, go about finding out if someone has this openness on a continuum or a spectrum, I'm sorry. So are they low or are they high? What questions are you going to ask? And it's usually a Likert scale, 1 to 5. I think not too many people use 1 to 7 anymore, because that whole middle question of doesn't relate to me, or it's not, not applicable, is not something that we want when we're collecting data, because that actually just equates to a 0. And that's not what we want to ask in these questions, or ask for what we need to answer. So factor analysis, so how many questions does it take? So with personality, it takes roughly 6 questions per factor. Ideally, you would not have less than 3, because then you're asking an either or question. And you really want to be able to dig deeper into what you're looking for. And factor analysis is also how are we posing the question relative to what we want to discover. So if you're asking someone about mystical experiences, you would want to know, one, how are you defining mystical experiences? And what are the factors involved in having a mystical experience? And as luck would have it, there is already a mystical experiences questionnaire out there relative for when you're in the lab actually taking hallucinogens and they want to understand your experience. As scientists, we often don't step back from our questions, which is why someone in my position who really enjoys exploratory factor analysis, I often get people will send me their questionnaires, send me their surveys or their instruments that they're designing, and say, okay, Nancy, can you take this for me and give me some feedback? Tell me what you think. Is this really getting at what I want to get at? And it's good to have that that position where you're removed from the research. So then I can go in and I can say, okay, I'm not really sure why you're asking me this question or how it's relative to what you're looking at, or maybe you're asking a double negative or a double positive. So you're not really getting at anything. For instance, if someone were to ask you, was your experience great or was your experience wonderful? Well, they're kind of the same thing. Great and wonderful can be along the same genre. So if you're looking to see if someone actually appreciated what you were providing for them, you don't want to lock them into a positive only question. And then other people will ask you 2 questions in a sentence. So you're not really sure, are they answering the first question or are they answering the second question? And that's another way factor analysis is helpful. And also, we don't want to have someone take a survey that is so long that it just exhausts them. I've done that before. I just recently got something from a university I used to attend. They wanted to know about alumni participation. And after about the 10th question, I'm sorry, I'm busy, I'm working, I'm trying to run a house and, help my elderly mother and take care of the dog and the cat, who I'm both allergic to. So I'm having all this, I don't have time to answer more than 10 questions. So as someone who does exploratory factor analysis, I can let you know if something is too long, and not just too long, but how many questions does it actually take to get at what you're wanting to ask. So with personality, it just so happens that they can do that in 6 to 10 questions per factor. They don't have to ask you anymore. I've actually been asked to scale back some surveys that have been as much as I think 48 questions, and I've got it down to actually roughly half of that around 27 questions, and still you're able to get at what you're trying to ask. So that is my little nirvana nerddom there. And I think I'm going to stop and let people ask questions. Hi, Brian.
And we do have a few questions. We have one we can start with from Dr. Gant, which is, yeah. So
I really enjoyed your presentation yesterday.
Great. So Dr. Gant's question is, you mentioned that TMI has an ethics review board. If an independent investigator wants to conduct research at TMI, where do they submit their protocol for review? Is this ethics board an IRB?
Yes, it is an IRB, and for those of you who don't know, that's an internal review board. Some places call the, human review board. Have one, and you can actually get a hold of Ross, because I believe he is on that review board, as well as a few others. So we do allow outside research, and we do collaborations as well.
Nancy, in my talking to you, you've been doing a lot of analysis of the work that Ross has talked about with the MC squared group, crunching their data. How's that data crunching coming along?
It's fascinating because it was my first experience looking at EEG output, and it's really interesting to see. A lot of times we have like a popped electrode, so the data is just all over the place, and you have to section it off and say, okay, that's not going to give us anything we need. And then we see the occasional, or not, the more than occasional, we'll see these bursts of what we believe to be gamma. Or we see a very steady EEG from like beginning to end. So you really know that this person is actually, they've put those headphones on and they're in. They're totally in, they're gone, they're having their OB, they're having their experience, they're doing a remote viewing, and you just know that they're steadily there. And then you see others that, oh yeah, that guy fell asleep. So it's been very interesting to be able to learn how that looks in real time, because we often just see those charts on the, when you Google brainwaves, you just see, oh, the frequency is really fast for this, or then beta is a little slower, and then alpha is a little slower than that, and then theta and then delta, So not only the amplitude is going down, but the frequency is lower as well. So it's been a great learning experience, and it's been fun. So I'm the type of person, because I'm a researcher, I do not like being privy to any information. So when Ross gives me this information, I don't want to know who had a #1 hit until at the end. I want to be able to look at somebody's EEG without being biased to it and just look at it for what it is, rather than saying, oh yeah, that's why that guy had a #1 hit. I don't want to do that, because then that's what you start looking for. You start looking for that information, and that's not what science is about. You don't want to look for that. Like I used to tell my students, if you go in knowing that you're looking for a red shoe, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find a red shoe.
Well, how lucky are we at the Institute to have a research geek working 4 days a week with us. Unfortunately for you, you've now got a lot of people who know who to send their questions to about any research they might be doing and how to handle it. All I remember from my statistic days is T-square and a couple of other terms. You stuck with it, and I'm so delighted. If you could research anything at all, what would you love to study?
Research. I've often been made fun of by mentors and people that I've talked to. I love research, and I love talking about research, and I love how is it designed, how is it handled, how, just everything about research methods, methodologies, the survey instruments, everything. Well, I find Psi to be extremely interesting, and I love, 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 love looking at that. If all I ever had to do was talk about research, that's all. I love everything there is about the research, the process, the whole thing. And I've even, if anyone's interested, I wrote quite a long, boring Aristotelian position on how research should be done.
I wish I had known you. 1980 was just a couple of years ago, wasn't it? When I was doing some research, not a very major thing. It was just an N of about 55, but I established a questionnaire that had yes, no, true, false, open-ended answers, and each answer was supposed to fit with 9 propositions I had in my thesis. And I took the results to the computer lab at the university, and I got a 1,000-page printout with 1 datum per page. So I had to revise my my methodology of studying that a little bit. It would have been nice to have had you on hand to.
Yeah, 1980, I don't think I would have been much help. I think I was probably in 6th grade or something.
You probably knew more about it than me then. Another note, TMI still needs to study the effects of SAM acoustics simulation. I guess this is to everyone from Jim, who did a lot of study of SAM acoustic. That's a lot to say all in one mouthful. SAM acoustic stimulation patterns on free-running EEG. Does SAM affect EEG activity and the power in different EEG bands? You get a little bit out of that out of the lab work you were doing before we closed down with the EEG studies, because that was SAM and hemisync together, wasn't it?
But we haven't had an opportunity to look at that yet. But we are investigating that. I think we're looking at 3 hertz interspersed with binaural beats, if I'm not mistaken. It's been so long since we've been allowed into the lab. It's kind of disappointing, but safety measures, the do no harm ethics thing.
Yes.
I actually have a question for you. So when you look at the EEG data now, do you, I know we talked about this in some of the previous days talks, but when you look at this stuff, can you look at an EEG and actually say, oh, I see this specific pattern and that probably means they did this? Like, has it gotten to the point where you see that there's repeatable patterns in people that you can actually recognize without even knowing anything about what kind of exercise they did or the experience?
I think as I'm going through an EEG, sometimes it can be like a fingerprint, depending on how often that person has been fingerprinted, But as far, I think across subjects, there's a lot of variability. I'll see some EEGs where it's relatively quiet and I can tell they're in alpha and beta and going back and forth. And it's pretty tame. And then, but they don't have any, they're not getting a remote viewing hit, or they're not having an OBE experience. Maybe they're in a meditative state. But I think there was one participant who throughout the week, I was able to tell that was definitely that person's EEG. Every time I looked at it, I was like, oh yeah, this is that, participant, XYZ from day one. So after looking at them, you can start seeing patterns, but I would not be able to say across participants as much as it might be within the participant themselves. And that you can't really say for sure unless you were looking at that person quite often, their EEG quite often.
Right.
We have another question, Nancy. Have you done any analysis of the random number generator?
No, I have looked at the website, the Global Consciousness Project. I was very interested in that at one time. But I think the last time I looked at their data, it's very hard to mine that data. So I wasn't able to lift it out, but I have read reports on RNG data from their website and some fascinating stuff. And I would like to set up a study independent of the Global Consciousness Project. So it is very fascinating if anyone has gone on there and read some of the papers that come out of it. I think a few years ago, it might have been 2014 or 15, somewhere between 2014 and 2016, Paris had that terrorist attack. And then I believe it was the day before or the same day down in Africa, they also had a terrorist attack. So the localization of the RNG patterns was very specific to where those attacks happened. So they saw that spike in Paris just prior to it. And they also saw it not in other places as strong, but then the one that they have down in the continent of Africa, I'm not sure what country it was, theirs also started going off random as well around the time of their attack. So it's fascinating.
It's
That's
interesting.
incredible. Yeah. I think it'd be really interesting in the context of sort of MC squared to actually look at influences over random events, kind of in the real world. And I know, I think it was the Paranomalies lab that the Princeton Engineering Anomalies lab that did some of that research where they actually had people trying to influence random events, either with like, balls kind of dropping through a big maze with pins where it would kind of bounce off different things. But they had some really significant results, as I remember. So it'd be interesting to see, especially as we have people coming to the Institute who, tend to do kind of this thing really well. They were using just regular people off the street. It'd be interesting to see how Monroe participants would compare against just sort of a random audience, because the people who come here, tend to.
Yeah.
Kind of
Ross wants to chime in here.
Yeah, I to say if I could just jump in here a second.
Go ahead.
We have a fair amount of RNG data, accumulated from various Monroe programs, especially Discovery, and some from MC squared. I think maybe that's what Sandy's referring to. I did a brief sort of overview of some of the RNG data from Discovery sessions and found some tantalizing stuff that it does need to be pursued. And you're giving us ideas. I think it's going to be something we got to pile into. Tons of it, mountains of it, just sitting there waiting to be crunched.
Yeah, since we're sitting on our haunches, we might as well.
Crunch data.
Yeah, crunch.
Yes.
I get this visual.
And the shutdown actually presented an opportunity. I ran an RNG up at RMR continuously for several months before lightning took everything out, and so I've got a long baseline, which I just want to see if nobody's around, what's that RNG doing on its own.
Maybe we could compile the RNG data from each residential program we've had and then compare it against the baseline we've been running for the last year.
I mean, what we got to do is set one up somewhere on campus. I was doing it in the utility room and just let that thing run continuously. So we have a continuous record of an RNG on campus.
We do have one more question for you, Nancy, and you can stay in, Ross, if you like. How do you control for the experimenter's hypothesis energetically affecting the results?
Good
There
question.
I've talked with this to Ross when I first came, because he's like, well, we take the envelope and, I pick it off the computer and then I put it in the envelope and someone else. I'm like, well, still, they're either reading you or they're reading, something before that. So it's challenging, not only just to control the energy, but also you don't know, are they getting that information because they're, going into the past? Are they going into the future? Are they reading Ross? Are they reading Paul? Are they connected to the computer somehow? So they know what the computer's picking actually. Did they talk to themselves in the future and then run back and say, oh, this is what it's going to be? It's very challenging to do that. And that's kind of what my paper touched on a few years ago, about how we're picking the outcome as soon as we ask the question, because we have that much influence on, what's going on. As we actually are, even as researchers, as much as we try to stay unbiased and step back, we influence these things, either by the way we're asking the question, looking at the question, or just influencing, like you said, energetically. It's very difficult to tease apart.
Yeah, it's almost like you need a.
Have you ever come across a publication that's rather fun called the Journal of Irreproducible Results?
No.
It's kind of satirical, but the thing I love most about it is on the copyright page. It says, this book is copyright and none of the contents may be reproduced by any means, physical or otherwise. And it's the Journal of Irreproducible Results. So.
I just had a friend and some professors down at the University of West Georgia. They're publishing a study actually where they're looking at the textbooks, and these studies that we're all very familiar with and were taught over and over and over again actually have never been replicated. So there is actually no proof that they are doing what they're doing, just off of one study.
Off one study. Well, thank you so much for your work in putting this together, your work with the Institute. And I look forward to the next time I'm down in the gatehouse and you're in the room upstairs, popping up and putting my head around the barricade and having a few words with you directly.
Me too.
In person.